But joining us now live from Rome is Catholic News Network Vatican correspondent Colm Flynn. Colm, great to see you. You're there where the action is. So it's obviously world leaders are there. You've had Trump and Zelensky, the Pope lying in state. Tell us all about it, Colm.
Rowan, good evening to you from the Eternal City, and hey, Rita and James as well. And by the way, Rita, I glued myself to the cobblestones in St. Peter's today, but nobody took any notice of it. Fantastic time. But, you know, before we talk about, which I'm sure we will, the complicated legacy of the Holy Father, Pope Francis, you know, many beautiful moments, but a lot of confusion at times as well. I have to just be honest, today was an absolutely stunning day. It was a beautiful day weather-wise in Rome. You had 250,000 people in St. Peter's Square and around the vicinity to pay their final respects. And, you know, even though Pope Francis, of course, famous for his kind of move towards a more simplistic approach in Vatican affairs, and while his burial at Santa Maria Maggiore was more simplistic, a Vatican funeral is never toned down. It's never simple. You had all the delegates there on the right wearing black. On the left, you had the cardinals, the archbishops, the priests from all over the world. And while it was a moment to be remorseful, and, you know, we've lost the Holy Father, a spiritual leader, the successor of Peter, it was also a moment, I think, from talking to people in the crowd, to be grateful and happy for the wonderful moments that we did have with the Holy Father, but also to really see at a time like this the true universality of the Catholic Church. You know, we can get caught up and think it's just Ireland, it's just Australia, it's the USA. You meet people here from every walk of life, from every corner of the world. You can see there now just the book being laid on top of that simple wooden and zinc coffin, which the Pope requested. And Cardinal Giovanni Battista Re, he was presiding over this Requiem Mass. He gave a beautiful homily. He said, look, Pope Francis was a shepherd looking after his sheep. He mentioned all the 47 apostolic journeys he made around the world. Many of them I went on with him, including to the nation of Iraq, a very dangerous trip, even though he was told not to go. So it was a beautiful day. It was a very poignant procession when he was brought from the square, because he requested that he wouldn't be buried inside St. Peter's Basilica, breaking a tradition, I think, going back over 120 years. So the motorcade made their way through Rome for around 25 minutes into the Basilica of St. Mary Major, and there he was laid to rest. So today we mark the end of a papacy, and we say goodbye to the Holy Father, Pope Francis.
James.
You know, you mentioned the universality of the Catholic Church. I mean, that's what the word Catholic ultimately means. One of the things that I was struck by was, and in fact I've noticed, you know, in attending churches and masses in Australia, is that many of the priests are from the Philippines, they're from Africa, and I saw a number of cardinals from around the world. Tell us about the prospects of where the next pope might come from. You know, there are people like Cardinal Sarah, who is older, I think he's 79, so possibly too old for it, but very doctrinally sound and one of the best thinkers and theologians, I think, that we have around living today. Tell us about the growth of the church in these places like Africa and South America, and where that sort of new vibrancy is coming from for the church, you know, that may in places like Australia or in Europe, mass attendance is down, faithfulness is down, and of course, you know, there are other competing, shall we say, other faiths coming to the fore.
Yeah, and James, you're absolutely right. Someone like Cardinal Sarah from Africa is seen as someone who has great intellectual wattage. He is one of the intellectual heavyweights in the College of Cardinals, I would say. And, you know, look at our countries, Ireland and Australia. My country, even though just a population of a couple of million people, we were a factory producing priests and nuns for years. We evangelized Africa, Asia. We sent priests to Australia and to the United States. The tide has now turned. In fact, people say the future is Africa, the future is Asia. That's not right. It's now. And what I really notice is that people try and talk about, you know, the conservative, more traditional side of the Catholic Church. And they always fall back on the Americans, and they say, oh, the American conservatives, as if this is some kind of fringe group in the church. That could not be further from the truth. Last year, I went to Kenya and Uganda. I interviewed the Bishop of Nairobi, and he said, Colm, we have a similar problem. You're from Ireland, you have a crisis of vocations, because we don't have any seminarians in our seminaries. He said, we have a crisis of vocations here too. I said, what? He said, we have too many, and we don't know where to put them. They are now exporting them right around the world. And remember, they come from countries that have more traditional values. their priorities are not the kind of things that have been discussed at the synod here. Maybe some of the places that Pope Francis put an emphasis on over his papacy. They need to build schools, they need to build hospitals, they need to build roads, they need to feed their people. In fact, I'd go even further than that. In some places like Ghana, I interviewed a group of sisters and I said, oh, you know, they were there in their habits and they looked very sweet. And I said, what do you do, sisters? Thinking that they were going to say they pray in the convent. And they said, we work out in the rural areas, rescuing children who their parents believe have been cursed by witchcraft if they're born with special needs or disabilities. This happens today, and this is what the church has to deal with. So I think in Africa, when you're looking to the future, in this upcoming conclave, they want to see those values, those family values, those truthful values, the gospel. They want to see that not only reflected in the Catholic Church, but they want to see it supported by the church and promoted by the Catholic Church. So that is why I think this is going to shape up to be a very interesting conclave this time around.
Rita.
Well, you talked about Pope Francis's complicated legacy, and he did lean into all sorts of issues that you wouldn't expect the Pope to lean into, like global warming, at a time where Christians were being persecuted in many parts of the world. How will he be ultimately remembered? What do you think his legacy will be?
You know, Rita, how they say a legacy is in the eye of a beholder, and people much smarter than I will debate this for years. But the interesting thing about that is, on one hand, you know, he did focus a lot on the environment. Now, as Christians, we believe we do have a responsibility to look after this gift from God. We have to be good stewards of this land. But, you know, I was listening to your discussion before we came on air, and the problem with the Pope Francis papacy sometimes for, you know, practicing Catholics, and I don't want to even say conservative because people use that as a way to diminish them or demean them, but people who were just serious about their faith, believed what they preached. You know, the Pope always reached out to the LGBT community. He made it more welcoming and more accepting on one hand. But then on the other hand, he said just last year that gender ideology was the greatest evil of our time. I remember standing outside the Basilica reporting on that. Now, the problem with his legacy and with his reputation, I think he was misrepresented because, as you know, a lot of media outlets, when they hear a phrase like the Pope saying, "Who am I to judge?" It's the front page of the New York Times, it's leading all the news bulletins. But when he says, look, we should be more welcoming, but the sacrament of marriage remains and will never change. It will be between a man and a woman. That doesn't really go as viral or doesn't get picked up. So I think sometimes Francis, he wasn't much different than Pope Benedict when you really read what they said, but certainly his tone was different, and that was what got him his legacy and reputation that he has today.
Colm Flynn, thanks so much for talking to us from Rome. There's lots more we could chat about, China and the Pope and so on, but we've got to leave it there. But thank you for telling us all about that and those insights there. Fantastic stuff.